My guest today is Jen Stout, who is the author of a new book called Night Train to Odesa, which I highly recommend. And Jen is a former TV and radio producer at the BBC who has spent quite a bit of time in both Russia and even more in Ukraine. Jen, I wanted to ask you about your book. Why did you write it? What prompted you to embark upon this project?
Well, you know, when you're reporting on the ground and you have so much material, like there's so much extra stuff that doesn't make it into the word count. And that was partly it, was this compulsion to sort of describe in more detail the places, the amazing places that I'd been, the people that I'd met. And I also wanted to kind of kick against the stereotypes of Ukraine as like, especially the east of Ukraine, as somewhere post-Soviet, grim, grey, war-torn, because these are beautiful, complex places with a really interesting history, and it's really kind of crucial that we understand them in a more nuanced way. And I kind of, that's a book-length project.
So in some ways your book is a tribute to the Ukrainian struggle and a document of what is taking place.
Yeah, I hope so. I think it's really, really important that we understand the background to this war. You know, it's too easy to fling up our hands and say, oh, why can't they just stop fighting? I wanted to explain, because I've studied this a lot of my life, you know, this part of the world, and I wanted to explain about the colonialism behind this, the centuries of oppression and Russification that led to all this, and the imperialism on the part of Russia. But I didn't want to do this in like a history tangent, because I don't like reading that stuff. I find it quite dry. So I thought I'd try and tell it with stories and places and anecdotes, and that's how you grab people, isn't it?
This really is politics from the ground up.
Yeah.
It's not what the British call high politics. It's not about diplomacy, geopolitics, military strategy. It's about the human beings on the ground. What was the most harrowing experience that you had that you chronicle in the book?
Most harrowing. Listen, I think there's an interesting thing about stuff that stays with you or that messes you up. And it's often not like the Big Bang. It's often not the kind of thing that you might classically think of as being really scary. It's when you witness things that shouldn't happen, that go against your moral sense of how the world should be. And that, so often it would be people's pain that really stuck with me. So I was interviewing a few times a mother called Olena, a grandmother, and she was looking for her son, for the Russians snatched him, and she was walking miles and miles every day during occupation, during shelling, no gas at home, no electricity, and trying to ask the Russian occupiers for information about her son, and they just lied to her face, and she knew that they were lying really, and she said they would look behind her shoulder, they would never look her in the eyes. And then they found out, of course, that all the time, as they well knew, he'd been shot and left on the side of the road. Her anger and pain really stuck with me. You know, it still sticks with me. And a lot of stuff about kids, obviously, like kids, the trauma that they experience.
Now, almost 20,000 children have been abducted.
Far more,
or if not more.
I think far more. Yeah, in re-education camps.
That's part of what you were talking about, colonialism, right?
Mm-hmm. They re-educate the children to make them Russians because the Russians seem to believe that Ukrainians are just misguided Russians, gone astray.
Isn't part of it too, though, that Putin sees this as a land grab, a resource grab, and that he sees a declining population in Russia itself?
To an extent, but I really don't think that's the biggest factor. I think it really is ideological. I mean, he spelled this out, you know, in that insane essay that he wrote just before the invasion. The main factor for them is the existence of a Ukrainian state. That is offensive to them. They see that as a security threat, even though the Ukrainian state was not threatening Russia in any way. And even recently, you've heard them reiterate that when they're talking about negotiations and the kind of preconditions they would look for. They say, well, we have to eliminate, you know, the threat to us. And they mean the existence of a Ukrainian nation. And they've been trying to eliminate that or liquidate, when you use the Soviet terminology, for a very long time by banning the language, by killing the writers, the intelligentsia, especially in the 1920s, where most of them ended up in the Gulag and murdered. It's classic stuff, right? You steal the children, you re-educate them, and you kill the writers, and they've been doing that.
One of the interesting aspects of your book and your stay is that you actually were in Russia in the months preceding the actual invasion. Tell us a little, what was your impression of Russia before it actually invaded when you were there?
Peter Pomerantsev wrote a great book called Nothing is True and Everything is Possible. And I think that sums up that kind of post-truth thing that you find in Russia now. And I think post-truth is really, really dangerous. You know, people would say to me, like I'd say, the news you're getting is not true. And they'd say, well, you have your truth and we have ours. Where do you go from there, right? And I think actually the nothing is true and everything is possible, you could change it to say nothing is true and anything is possible.
Now, when people told you that, were those people in the regime or people, the common
Just
people?
normal people.
Normal people who sort of absorbed the credo of the regime.
They do, and I would find trying to maintain conversations with people who supported the, and of course not a war, but the special military operation, and they would just use phrases from the TV as they spoke to me, and I'd say, could you use your own words? And they kind of couldn't. And you have to remember, like, how many years of like just relentless propaganda and screaming on the television. So I was watching, as you say, I was there as things built up towards war. And what you saw on Russian TV was a huge amount of propaganda, not necessarily about how terrible Ukraine was and that they were going to attack, because everyone knew they weren't, but about the supposed genocide in the Donbass. So they alleged, and they've been doing this for years, just making stuff up, that the Ukrainian government, the regime, had been killing Russian speakers in Donbass. This is not true, but they really hammered into it, and they're very good at propaganda, right? They've done it a long time. So people really believe that. They really, really believe that.
When you left Russia, you left as soon as the invasion began. Is that correct?
A few days after, yeah.
And what prompted you to leave?
The program I was on, the Alpha Fellowship, was abruptly brought to an end for understandable reasons. I would have left anyway. I was desperate to go. I mean, like, morally, I just didn't want to stay in that country. I had a lot of friends in Ukraine. They were messaging me saying, you know, they're bombing us with jet planes. I mean, I didn't want to spend another second on Russian territory, frankly. And I wanted to go to Ukraine.
But you ended up going to Romania.
Yeah, beautiful Romania. So we got out. I went to Vienna. And bear in mind, like, at that time, they closed down a lot of the airspace. So it was, you had to go through Istanbul, which you still can. I got to Vienna and I thought, okay, where are we going to go? What am I going to do? And I really didn't want to go home. That would have been kind of gutting. So I spoke to some people who were involved in this big network of, you know, just citizen kind of volunteers trying to get people out of Ukraine and help refugees and get supplies into Ukraine. It was huge. And I knew someone in Romania who had lived in the island I come from. She said, right, go down to Dobruja, which is the southeast of Romania. No one really knows that much about this place. I didn't know much about it. And there the Danube forms the border between Ukraine and Romania. And so loads of people are coming across on this tiny barge every single hour, like open barge, freezing winter weather. Thousands of people, like kids and old people and women, of course. So I ended up there with the help of some volunteers, stayed in someone's boat repair workshop for a few weeks. And I was reporting on refugees. You know, I can speak Russian, so I could talk to them because they're from the south and east of Ukraine. And I started writing more kind of long form for the London Review of Books and doing a lot of radio. But all the time I was thinking, can I go to cover the war? And I really wanted to, but I didn't want to rush in like totally green and unprepared. So it took a bit of effort, bit of trying to find the money. But I did a short training course. I managed to get a flak jacket from some volunteer, and I went to Ukraine in late April.
And what was the first thing you did when you went to Ukraine?
So I was with a convoy taking aid to the military hospital, which was great because they kind of sped through all the checkpoints, and it could have taken a lot longer to get to Odesa.
So you went to Odesa first?
I went to Odesa, yeah. And this was a city I dreamed of seeing all my life, you know? Really, I mean, it's so beautiful. And I was standing outside the military hospital talking to these volunteers there, and kind of the atmosphere was so charged, but in a really like good way. People were there's a great sense of collective effort, of solidarity, and also of pride that they were managing to hold off the Russian advance. Because remember, nobody thought Ukraine could survive a few days. You know, they thought Kiev would fall, Zelensky would flee or be killed. And there they were, you know, still there. Odessa at the time was under threat from all sides, really. So the land, like Mykolaiv, was holding off the Russian army, but if that fell, they would advance. There was threat from the Black Sea, you know, these gunships with bristling guns pointing straight at the city, and from Transnistria, which is where Russian troops are still stationed in Moldova. And so there was many reasons for me to not go there, but there were more reasons for me to go there, you know, and I'm so glad that I did.